each other. Hi, guys.
We've not been together this whole time.
Welcome back to another episode of Rethinking Porn Addiction. I'm Nate. I'm here with Hans, Jake, and Kristen. We're hoping that Doug jumps on as well. And I am joined for the first time today by this little nugget.
It's Aurora's debut!
Who is swaddled to my chest, and I'm trying really hard not to wake up. So I want to pick up kind of the conversation that we were on last week and see if we can kind of wrap it up with a bow. Last week, we kind of started having this conversation about the intersection of sexual health and sexual morality. And I think one of the things that we started to kind of allude to was that at least when we were growing up, there was a set of rules, a set of commandments, a set of covenants that you make that we made that kind of defined whether or not we were sexually or spiritually healthy. And somebody else was kind of setting the bar. There's Doug. Hey, Doug.
Hello.
We just barely started. So what I was just saying is that last week we kind of started establishing this idea that the sexual morality that we were raised with was kind of an adherence to a set of rules, a set of commandments, a set of covenants, a set of guidelines that were given to us by somebody else, whether it was our parents or our religion or the community that we grew up in. And when that was the case, somebody else was kind of setting the bar for what was healthy and what was not healthy. And what I'm starting to realize is if we take the analogy of physical health a little bit further, remember last week we said if you want to be physically healthy, it's not just you avoid disease. You also need to eat healthy, and you need to exercise, and you need to get 8 hours of sleep. There are things that you need to do, that you need to pursue in order to be physically healthy. And the same is true with sexual health. It's not just the avoidance of disease. It's not just the avoidance of addiction or whatever negative thing that you want to avoid in your life. It's also the pursuit of things that will cultivate health. And that's where we kind of started integrating the 6 principles of sexual health. But then I started thinking about this a little bit further, and I think this is where we can take the conversation today, is everybody's definition of health is a little bit different when it comes to physical health. Like you've got a runner who might be going for endurance. You've got a weightlifter who might be trying to move lots of heavy weights. You've got dancers and skiers and soccer players and all these different type of athletes. And what is healthy for one may not be healthy for quote unquote healthy. We may not align with the goals of somebody else. And so what I wanted to talk about today is how do we kind of separate ourselves from this idea of healthy sexuality that is imposed on us by somebody else and start cultivating sexual health based off of what our needs, our goals, our desires, and our own personal preferences look like. So how do you guys feel about talking about that today?
I think it's a great place to start and where to pick up from last week.
Oh, well, thank you, because I'm gonna rely on, I really don't want to wake this human up. So Doug, you didn't see this, but I have Aurora strapped to my chest, right?
Oh, that's
I'm gonna volley the conversation over to you guys to kind of, now that I've set it up, and see kind of where this goes. Ready to go.
Ready to go.
Well, Kristen, remind me, but have we talked so far in the program around the juxtaposition of sexual health and healthy sexuality? Just why those words, why we say sexual health instead of healthy sexuality.
Can you help clarify that for us, Doug?
Yeah, because we haven't. We've talked about the ideas of sexual health and the principles of sexual health, but we've not talked about why this difference is so important to start to explore.
Well, I think the word sequence matters.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy sexuality it imposes a kind of an either or. Either it's healthy or it's not healthy. Right? So Hans, I see you started shaking your head. I mean, does something come to mind when you just hear that? Just me saying that?
Yeah, when you said that, it does for sure. I've heard those two phrases before. To me, they sound like synonyms at first pass.
Mhm.
But hearing you say that one of them feels binary rings true with me. It does. Yeah. Either you have healthy sexuality or you don't. Whereas sexual health maybe offers a spectrum and more space for curiosity and discovery and those type of healthy activities.
You said it better than I could have.
I doubt that, but thanks for letting me have a chance.
No, I mean, you really made it. But what I liked what you did, Hans, was all you have to do is point out to people that healthy sexuality is kind of an either or proposition.
Yeah.
And they begin to think, oh my God, that's right. And I don't know if I like that, or I don't know how I feel about that, or I don't know if that really fits for me. It starts creating some good questions.
It also, not only is it either or, but it's usually defined by and created by other organizations, groups of people. Can you hear my kids in the background?
Today is COVID Family Day. Let's just call it.
Recording time. They were in school. They're clearly.
What class are they in right now?
Yeah.
Recess.
Yeah. So hold on. You just keep talking.
Okay. All right.
So I want to throw in, and this might be where Kristen was headed, and it might not be, but this reminds me a little bit of David Schnarch's work, and we called him out last week, I believe. We kind of gave him a shout out, who he recently passed away.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talks about is how the low desire partner always controls sex in a relationship, like the amount of sex, the frequency of sex, what type of sex you have. And I think in a healthy sexuality world, the person who has the least tolerance for any sort of sexual act, idea, fantasy, or whatever gets to set the rules, gets to create the definition. And I think there's a power imbalance inside of any relationship, whether it's a parent-child relationship or like a romantic relationship. There's an imbalance of power because one person gets to decide what's healthy, and if they decide it's not healthy, if they decide it's not appropriate, it doesn't matter what the other person thinks because it's already been ruled out as taboo or inappropriate or dirty or bad.
Jake, thoughts about that? You're kind of shaking your head. Does something come to mind when Nate says that?
No, I think that's one of those things where it's important to name because I don't know how many people acknowledge that. But I do think it's pretty prevalent in at least most of the relationships that I know of.
Yep.
So it's more just sort of nodding in agreement of, yeah. And I wonder how many people really realize that's going on,
When I teach, I teach and train professionals around the country and on different aspects of sexual health. And one of the things I really like to affirm, Nate, is exactly what you just said. What I say to them is, when it comes to talking about sex, the most uncomfortable person in the room has all the power.
Mm.
Because all they have to say is, that's disgusting. That upsets me. No, that's wrong.
How could you?
How could you? And the entire room moves to their perspective. All they have to do that, and it's so culturally expected in our culture that we don't have to be aware of it. We automatically do it. The person who objects, the person who thinks it's sinful, the person who finds it inappropriate, we immediately adjust the conversation to address their complaint. It's just the way it works. The comfortable people don't have the power when it comes to talking about sex in this country,
or the people who want something that the other person doesn't want.
Right.
Obviously that goes back to comfort, but there's something to be said about the person who has the least tolerance for talking about sex gets to set the rules.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that's what we're dealing with. So if you've got a church that has a really messy sexual history or doesn't want to get involved in people's sex lives other than abstinence, then it's really difficult to navigate around what's right and what's wrong, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, because I don't know how to finish this thought, but there's a juxtaposition there.
Well,
There's
how I would
inbound
estimate the difficulty you're having finishing it is because it's the binary. The only way to keep talking about this is one or the other. And
right.
it just eventually just kind of makes the conversation kind of fall apart.
So
how do we do when ultimately one person has to be right?
So how do we introduce nuance without contradicting or conflicting with values that we hold dear?
So I think this has been a quote that I find helpful by Carl Jung that says, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate.
That's one of my favorite quotes.
I agree. And I think most of us have a rule book around sexuality that we're not even aware of, that we have certain rules of do's and don'ts and behaviors that are okay and things that are not okay. And I think, Doug, step in, but I think times we're not even aware of who has authored our sexual rule book. And we are viewing this as healthy sexuality, and sexual health is starting to be like, wait, where do I fit? If I'm the author, what do I want? Where do I feel in line? And where do these line up with my morals, values, covenants, all of that? But initially, I don't even think people are aware of that they are playing by a rule book and what those rules are, but they get played out in their life.
Yep.
Kristen, a lot of what you just said, use the word, what are my or me, or what do I believe? And I am, as Doug was talking earlier about the idea of the person in the room who's the most uncomfortable has the most power.
Mm-hmm.
When I think back to myself, I was personally very uncomfortable just with the idea of thinking about different moral values than what I had been taught or learned from my society and my culture around me. And so I think even before we start thinking about having conversations with others about who has the most uncomfortableness or who has the power, it really is important that we start thinking or talking about it and give ourselves permission to talk about it with ourselves and to navigate stuff on our own. And when I went running with a buddy this past week, and he asked me how these conversations were going, what we were talking about. And I told him as clearly as I could, the idea that I had, or that we explored, of sexual morality versus sexual health. And I want to acknowledge I went through a difficult transition, and I know it can be very difficult for anyone that goes through that difficult transition of confronting that awkwardness, I guess, is where I'm going with this, and being willing to actually, for the first time, think, okay, I am going to actually be willing to explore my awkwardness, my anxiety, my discomfort around the idea of talking about my personal sex, sexual desire, pleasure, all of those things that make us uncomfortable, a lot because of the morality that we've grown up with, or that we've taken in from the influences around us.
Okay, so I want to slow that down a little bit. I loved the phrase, I was willing to move into my uncomfortableness.
Yeah.
What the listeners might be interested in is, what makes somebody willing to do that?
And that's kind of what I was. Thanks, Doug. I love that thought. I would love to hear from any of us that wants to share that, how I got to that point. Mm-hmm. And I kind of compared it to other things in my life where I ran into a roadblock or a hurdle or something that was difficult, and I had to figure out a new way to navigate it. I think about finances. Like when I was young, I didn't really know a lot about finances or financial health. I just kind of went along with what was told to me. And then I got to points where I started running into trouble, and I had to figure out how to navigate things on my own and navigate my own financial well-being. And for me, I went through a transition period like that around sexual issues also, where I had to, for the first time, think, I had to try to balance or reconcile a lot of my personal human experience with factors that were external to me, that I took in from the outside, from one place or another. And that was a tough thing to do. And I'm very glad that I have started moving into that space, and I'm willing to explore that.
There's been some words that I wrote down because this word awkwardness comes up a lot. I'm like, oh, awkward. But I wrote down the words. That you're a traveler, and that when we travel to like foreign countries around the world, there can be a level of awkwardness if you don't speak the primary language. But you use the words explore and willing, and when we travel in new countries, it's usually with a lot of anticipation. We go in with expectations of, I don't know the social norms, I don't know the language, I don't even know how to get around town. But we approach it from this place of, like, there's a lot of room for curiosity and to ask for help and to get a guide. And I'm not so sure that being curious about our sexuality is all that different, other than we have a bit more rigidity around what we can and cannot do, what we can, who we can talk to, who we cannot, asking for help. And we embrace a bit of awkwardness to, this may be awkward just because it's new, it's foreign, it's unknown. And that to me is a bit more, I don't want to put the word exciting on, but in some ways we're doing this as we're exploring new territory, but with sexuality, it just feels different, I think, because of the environment.
I think that's part, I love this analogy. Like, I want there to be more excitement and curiosity around exploring this stuff. And I want to speak to the reality that I think a lot of us are in right now, which is, it's not like you're not getting dropped in the center of London and being said, go explore, go find like Big Ben and check out the, like, that's not how it is. We're being dropped into a city that we've heard could be like the murder capital of the world, and it's dangerous and scary and dark, and there might be some cool stuff there, but also your life could be at risk. You know, we kind of alluded to this over past episodes, but I'd love to explore this a little bit more. I think part of that fear in stepping away from the structure of the healthy sexuality instead of sexual health, like, there's structure in commandments, there's structure in rules. There's this idea that if I keep these rules, I'm going to stay safe. And if we step away from those and live a more principled life, it does mean we have more freedom. But with that freedom comes the fear of encountering things that we don't want to encounter. Mm-hmm. And there's the idea that a lot of us have been raised on, that there's no moral floor when it comes to pornography or sex. That if I do something that's deviant or taboo, or I'm interested in it, and I pursue that, it could lead me down paths towards things like rape or infidelity or child pornography or graphic things that are completely against my value system. And so I think that I love the analogy that you're painting here, but I think that the fear and the anxiety and the awkwardness that Hans was talking about comes a lot from the fact that we were raised in this space, in these families, and around this narrative that if you do go explore this area, you could get lost and never return. And you could end up in prison, or you could end up hurting somebody. You could end up getting, arrested. You could end up losing every relationship that's valuable to you. Not worth going down that road. Better to just stay safe.
Why do you think that story is told so often and so well?
Because it works.
In what way?
It works to get the results that. So when you want to know the purpose of something, you don't look at what people say the purpose is. You look at what the purpose accomplishes, like what it accomplishes. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
so what does the story accomplish that makes it such a good one?
I think it creates a lot of people who are very obedient and who don't rock the boat. People who It prevents people from questioning or exploring, or whether it's your family or your religion. I think it keeps people in line in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps people from having to confront things that are uncomfortable for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like I know a lot of families, especially in conservative environments, are really uncomfortable with homosexuality.
Yeah.
And so if we just don't talk about it, if we pretend it doesn't exist, if we make it bad, then even if somebody has same-sex attraction, is attracted to people of the opposite sex, they're not going to rock the boat and stir up discomfort in the family or in the community or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it keeps the peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It avoids a very painful dilemma and conflict.
Yes. Those are some of the things that come to my mind.
Yeah.
It also maintains the standard. And I think that's one of the things when you go back to that traveling to a different city analogy. When you go to a new place, a new city, there is all the unknown, right? So that leads to exploration and curiosity because there is unknown. With this, particular topic, I think there is a standard that we're taught, and there is a way, and that this is the way, and this is how you do this way.
Very
And
Mandalorian of you.
naturally kills curiosity. It naturally kills exploration. It naturally sort of or hinders the growth of these things. And I think it's important to understand that. Like when we go back to Hans's, sort of introduction to this, he said, I was willing, and then it got to the point where I had to learn to navigate this on my own. And I think that's a very key statement that is, the more you think about that, the harder it is to actually achieve, that you have to be willing to do it on your own, from the inside out. And it's a hard step, especially from those of us that come from a background where everything is set up. The next steps, this is what you do, this is the next step, here you go. It's kind of like the little game of life, right? Like you can't go wherever you want. And then with Hans, you have to learn to navigate on your own. And I think once you start to do that, then you get into more of this curiosity and this exploration. And I want to also note, it's not like this exploration or curiosity is inherently negative, because I think sometimes in our culture, we think about exploration or curiosity, and it like, oh, why would you do that? There's that fear component. And for me, it's just, it can even be simple within, again, going back to sort of the morality and values-based topic of, there's room to explore in your values. And you can start small with all things. So you can write down, like, this is the way I feel about X, Y, or Z. And then it's easy to be curious and explore by saying, why? Why do I feel that way?
Jake, I'd like to give you an example of that exercise to kind of make it operationalized in a very concrete way.
Let's talk about, like, homosexuality is a very polarizing topic in conservative cultures. And so that could be one of, this is how I feel about homosexuality, right? Now, this is what I know. This is what I feel.
I'm going to suggest starting at a place that somebody can know without it having to be different from themselves. Somebody may write about what they believe or feel about homosexuality, but they don't have those desires, they don't have those attractions. So it's not as personal to them. Mm-hmm. Whereas I want to suggest a starting point for this idea about the world floor. And the starting point is consent. So when I go over the 6 principles of sexual health with men, I've had men cry in my office because they were so relieved they got at least one. And the one they got was consent. They were like absolutely certain they would not cross the principle of sexual health of consent. They had no interest in non-consensual behavior. They had it was absolutely beyond any comprehension that they would engage in non-consensual sexual activity. It just wasn't on their map. And so they're so certain about this, right? So then I stop and I ask them, tell me how you know this so well. How are you so confident about this? This is kind of cool, isn't it? You have this clear, absolute confidence in yourself that I wouldn't do that. Well, great. Let's build on that. Whereas, this idea of no moral floors, you could read those six sexual health principles, and a person would think, "Oh my God, I would never be able to do any of them. I have no limits." And so the consent one is such a powerful way for men to realize, "Oh my God, I do have a moral floor." And it's a good one to have. If you're going to start somewhere, let's start there.
I'm gonna pick that up. Just thinking about my own personal experience and history, and having come through the religious upbringing that I did, and hearing many of the things that Nate was talking about earlier about if you start to look at porn or engage in any kind of sexual pleasure, you're headed down a path to doom, death, and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there were times where I did consider, I enjoy looking at pornography. It's pleasurable. Does that mean that I am that person already? Like, am I going to go out at some point and non-consensually try to take advantage of somebody, which is the prescribed path, or is intoned a lot? And I appreciate you saying that, Doug, because I have that same absolute conflict with that idea that is who I am, or that's who I'm going to become, because sexual imagery was enjoyable or is enjoyable for me to look at. So the idea of having consent and being able to recognize the idea of I'm not going to cross a line of consent, and knowing that is one of your moral values is really empowering. And I think a great place to start.
Can I just say really quickly, Hans?
Yeah.
You said a word that is so like prescriptive. For so much, healthy sexuality lines out a prescription that will guarantee results. And if you move or deviate from what is prescribed or what is taught, then that's on you, because we warned you.
Right.
And I think that is scary because it's unknown. A prescription.
Yeah.
It comes with very clear instructions, and here's the results you can expect. It also comes with a lot of side effects to the medication, but prescriptive. I think there's safety in the rules and the prescription to be like, okay, this will keep me safe.
I'm curious, Doug and Kristen, from a clinical perspective, why do people believe that there's no moral floor? Like, where does that story come from? That if you look at the Victoria's Secret model and masturbate, that eventually, if you go down the road far enough, you're going to end up looking at child pornography or becoming a Ted Bundy or cheating on your wife or something like that. Where does that?
There's a word for this, Nate, and it's a kind of a theoretical word, and I don't mean to throw this out here in such a kind of academic way, but the word is degeneracy. And there's an idea out there that has been around about human beings for thousands and thousands of years. This is a very old story, that a human being left to their own devices will degenerate into abject immorality. And that's the only direction they have to go.
Pure hedonism. Pursuit of self-gratification.
Yeah. Whatever the story is, and that with that's just it's just the way it'll be, and it's a powerful story. It's a very powerful story.
Yeah.
And is it a true story from a clinical perspective?
Go ahead, Doug. I mean, I've worked with a lot of
I want to plead to the parents in this room who've been with little kids.
Oh man, you saw me on the first week.
Right. Have you ever seen a little kid go, "Oh, don't do that"? Like they're like, "No, don't do that." Well, who's telling them not to do that? Is it just some rule, or is there something in them that is horrified at what's about to happen? Where does that come from? There's something there that's a backstop. I don't know what it is, but I think there are backstops. We have.
And clinically, I would say majority of the clients have their stops. They have their lines. They just don't realize, like, they don't recognize them as such. Like Doug said, of, oh, I am following principles. I just didn't know it. I do have a moral floor. I just didn't know it. A lot of the people that I work with have been following guidelines. If they're looking at visual imagery, they have guidelines that they have been following, and they haven't crossed for years or decades. It's not progressed to where it just keeps going and going and going.
Yeah.
You guys understand why I'm asking this question, though, right? Because I think there's a lot of people here who are afraid that they will degenerate. And I think there was somebody who joined our Facebook group today. I always ask people, like, why are you joining? And not everybody answers, but one man recently, it was either today or sometime this week, answered, I'm going through a divorce. And I don't feel like my pornography is a problem, but my wife does. And she's ready to, like, divorce me and keep me from seeing my kids. And I think that a lot of the fear, we haven't spoken much, and maybe now's not the time to, but we haven't spoken much about the perspective of the partner, of the person who's looking at pornography. And so I think that a lot of this moral floor conversation deals with the person who's consuming the pornography or the sexual imagery, but there's also, on the flip side, there's the fear of the person who doesn't understand the fantasy, who doesn't understand the pleasure, who doesn't understand the desire to watch this type of stuff, and the fear behind that of, this is not something that I want. It's not something I'm comfortable talking with. It's not something I want to be part of our relationship. And I'm afraid that you will degrade and become a version of yourself that is the worst possible version of yourself, that you'll hurt me, you'll hurt our kids. You'll be
Nate, the idea is, in that state of pleasure,
there you are.
In that state of pleasure, of abject fantasy or heightened arousal, or, man, that thing that I love the most really arouses me. The idea is, in that state, you don't have the same morals that I want you to have when you're not in that state. And it's as if there's not an ethical, space that you can have in that same state of sexual pleasure and imagery. There's this idea is that they can't coexist. They cannot coexist. And that's really terrifying for people.
Well, the partner, there's a whole lot of for a lot of women, their sexuality begins once they're married. Their sexual identity, their sexual values, what they want. There's not been a lot of that. And so much of a partner's sexuality is dependent upon their partner. And I think it's very vulnerable. I don't think it's from a place of being able to dually negotiate. What do we want? Here's what I like. Here's what you like. It's like, I don't even know how my body works for a lot of people. But if I'm dependent on feeling safe with you, and women partners are getting the same narrative that you have said of, you're going to degenerate. Women have heard the same thing, and they're among groups of women. I mean, most everybody, if we were to walk down our neighborhood, someone's been touched by sexual imagery, meaning like that's impacted people's lives. And everybody has a horror story that validates your belief and ideas. And so
Right.
I really empathize, as you know, I empathize with the partner's position as well, because they have the narratives and they're in a vulnerable spot because for a whole different set of reasons.
There's not a whole lot of stories of people walking and telling their neighbors, I got to tell you about this amazing experience I had with porn.
No.
That doesn't happen. The only story that you hear is, let me tell you about the train wreck, disaster, heartache, life-ruining experience.
My child's getting divorced because of this. There's really not. And so I think
so that's a good example of why we're in this dilemma of degeneracy. Because we're most comfortable talking about sex after it's injured somebody. It's very difficult talking about sex when we've had pleasure or somebody else has felt pleasure with us.
Doug, will you say that again? I think that's important for our viewers to hear.
That, unfortunately, we're most familiar talking about sex after it's injured somebody or somebody's been hurt. That's when we're more comfortable having the conversation. We can talk about sex when sex has hurt somebody. But it's very difficult to talk about sex when it has pleasured somebody or yourself. We don't. That's not when we get to talk about it. It after the injury. So many times these couples were, Kristen and Jake, you shared your own experience not long ago. And you've also talked about how it brought so many things out into the open to be discussed. But the ticket of admission is somebody feels hurt.
Mm-hmm.
It's unfortunate that that's the price of admission for these conversations.
Yeah.
I had an aha moment a few minutes ago. Before we get too far away from it, I want to share it and see if it rings true with Nate and Jake, you guys, and Chris and Doug, if you've seen it in others. The aha moment was growing up, because of the prescribed morality that was around me, I don't think I had the opportunity to explore my moral floor or my moral values. So I didn't have experience. And let me make it more concrete. I have thought more than once in my life, because of my strict religious upbringing, I had no skill or confidence navigating porn or sexual imagery. It was just stay away from that. Don't touch it. Don't look at it. Everything that's like unto that is bad. And so I didn't ever gain skill about navigating what was okay to look at, what wasn't okay to look at. And I think a lot of our sexual morality was the same way. Do you feel that? Did you feel that I didn't, because of the moral guidelines I was given and I was trying to adhere to very strictly, I never learned to navigate or talk about or explore anything related to sex or pleasure.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's not a lot of guidelines for exploration or for understanding. It's entirely prescriptive. It's entirely this is it.
Right.
It's also framed in a very binary. This is right, and everything else is wrong.
Yeah.
Whether that's subvertly or overtly, it depends on who's in the room. When you were 12 through 18.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty common trend out there of this is what's right, and everything outside of this circle is wrong. And then furthermore, the consequences for being outside of that circle and being in the wrong are catastrophic.
Yeah.
And I think,
Hans, are you saying that you didn't even have a chance to discover that you did have, in fact, a moral floor? You had no idea to even discover that and to develop a confidence in it and to understand that about yourself.
That's totally what I'm saying. When I first even had the thought of stepping outside of the morals that I had grown up with and been given from many different influences, it was scary because I had no idea of where my moral floor was. I had never explored any of that space related to sex. I think that's exactly what Jake was saying, is until you have the opportunity to explore that, if you just stay within strict moral guidelines, there is no exploration, there's no skill building, there's no strength building, there's none of that. You're just adhering to a guideline.
And then there's an inherent fear of the unknown.
A huge fear of the unknown. Totally, Nate.
And then when you do stray outside those guidelines, you do it in secret. And there's a sense of like shame attached to it, and you have to hide it, because if anybody knew you were trying to sort this stuff out and figure out like what brings me pleasure, what are my fantasies, what is acceptable to me, what is not acceptable to me, then like even anything resembling that is terrible.
Yeah.
And the other, I can see Jake wants to go ahead, Jake.
I just want to comment on the fear thing, because we talked a little bit back ago of when we talked about this degeneracy, right? This fear of devolving into something. And then I was thinking more of some of the reasons why we don't confront this or bring this up is because there's that fear of pain and rejection. And I think, for those of us that were raised in the church, we hear this all the time, that fear is the antecedent of faith, right? Like fear is the opposite of faith and love. And I think there are so many relationships where there is no room for curiosity. There is no room for exploration. And when I mean relationships, I'm talking about your relationship with sexual imagery. I'm talking about your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with sexual, health or healthy sexuality. There's that fear that kind of becomes that first block. And I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that and to understand that and how much that permeates everything around it. To the point where, if I engage in this behavior, the fear is the consequence that I will either degenerate into, some sort of fiend,
Yep.
or I will lose all that I've been given in terms of, family or social construct. And for me, it was my aha moment from Hans was until you're able to sort of not begin in the absence of fear, but begin in the face of that fear. For me, I would be spinning my wheels. And I think that's why, going back to Doug, as pain starts this conversation, it's because at that point in time, the fear is sort of eradicated, right? Like you're at the bottom at that point. You don't have that fear preventing you. And so you then open up. And how much more pleasant of an experience would it be if you could face that fear without hitting the bottom and opening up yourself from that sort of mindset?
I'm just realizing another step of this equation and why I think it's so important to our relationships. So this idea of being raised and living in the morality world, in the healthy sexuality world, where everything is prescribed to you and you don't get this opportunity to explore, what happens is that when you get into a relationship with people, and this is what caused me the most shame, like the porn thing was scary and I felt terrible and I was ashamed of myself and stuff. But when I got into a relationship with others, I didn't know how to set my own ground rules.
Yeah.
Because my entire life, all of my sexual rules had been set for me. And so I will admit, in my first several relationships, the majority of my relationships when I was dating, I relied on my partner, the girl I was dating, to kind of set the ground rules for the relationship of what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And it varied depending on who I was dating. And there, I still have those, those dreams where your head pops off the pillow when you're almost asleep and you're like, I can't believe I did that. Or, I still have those moments thinking back on past relationships and realizing that I didn't have the courage or the skill set to set my own ground rules. So I didn't have principles to guide me through making my own decisions, really, other than, and to take that one step further, that puts women in a position where they're responsible for the sexuality of men. And it's no wonder that when a woman discovers her husband is looking at pornography, she sees it as a personal failure or a personal rejection or a personal attack. Because if it's anything, if their circumstance is anything like mine, I never had to be responsible. I never had room to be responsible for my own sexuality. Somebody else always had to take responsibility for it, unless I screwed up big enough that I needed to go fix something with a bishop or a religious leader or whatever. Then my guess is that a lot of women have been raised in the yang to the yin, which is they are overly responsible and therefore take any sort of misbehavior or any sort of actions that go against their values and principles as a personal affront, as their responsibility. I don't know. This is me just like putting, I don't know if that fits or not.
Nate, I think what's helpful here is let's not hold it up to scrutiny that it has to be accurate. This is what it's like to just be awkward and curious. And let's let
I'm just
be. I
pursuing
really like what you're saying. I really like just giving yourself permission to say this is wonderful.
We brought up the idea of covenants last week.
Yeah.
You know, within the Mormon faith, developing your agency is a key component. And I see that be true everywhere except within sexuality. When it comes to your sexuality, you actually don't have any agency. This is the prescription to follow. And I think that's important because you develop a trust in yourself over time. It's a normal developmental thing to lie. You lie at 5, you experience a consequence, and you're like, duh, and you start to develop. You have these experiences over time that shape you. And then you're 12 and you've had no experience with navigating your sexuality. There's just been nothing. And then at 12, you come across sexual imagery and you're like, oh, and you may have a wide range of emotions experience. Who knows? Your body might respond, your emotions come forward and you're like, I actually have zero idea how to handle this, how to navigate it. I know nothing because there's been zero preparation or ability to develop myself around this so that by the time that is entering.
Can I add to that, Kristen? And the adults that the child may want to rely on for help with this are living in the same experience.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not like they have the language or the experience to help navigate.
Right.
And that's what I wrote is the church is the moral floor.
Yep.
And is the healthy sexuality and developing you, like learning to trust yourself. Like that's the aha moment I'm getting from this is I'm hearing you all say the first time I got to see who I am as a sexual being occurred after I harmed someone or I was caught, but I started to learn that I actually do have a sexual ethic. I never had room until I was 30 or 40 or 20 to learn that I actually did. And then I had to start develop that.
So here's the interesting sort of juxtaposition that comes because when I hear the church is the moral floor in my life, the church became the moral authority, not the floor, but the authority. And it did it across a broad spectrum of aspects of my life. One of those, which was sexuality. So how do you reconcile the church being the authority here? And do you understand what I'm saying?
But not over there.
Well, but now we're basically saying, look, you've got to find your own moral authority. You've got to find your own moral floor when the church is sort of all encompassing in that regard.
Well, the dilemma is does it have to be an all or none proposition? Either you take it all and it's without exception, or you know, this is where it's really tough.
There's a term, Doug.
With our last meeting, people said, you know, there's things I value and I learned from my religion. I don't want to throw it all away. And you know, so where do we get to honor all this?
Can we talk about Jesus for a second? For real.
Yes.
I'm in.
This is just what's coming to mind for me. So the story of Jesus, and specifically his ministry, a lot of what he does is he comes in and looks at the church and he says, you guys are following way too many rules. You're obsessing way too much over the rules of what it constitutes being worthy and what doesn't constitute being worthy. And he comes down on the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these groups of Jews who are like, you can only take so many steps on Sunday and you can only eat certain types of food. And you can't, like, they have to spell out every single thing to make sure that they're doing things according to God's will. And he comes along and says, okay, I'm fulfilling that law, the law of Moses, which is the law of following all of these commandments and rules. And I'm going to give you a new set of rules, which is love one another and love God, not in that order. He says in the opposite order. And he focuses more on principles. Instead of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, like love your neighbor and send your action through that principle of loving your neighbor, and then make a decision of whether or not you should follow through on that thing that you're thinking about doing. And the people that Jesus Christ kind of condemned the most were the people who were strict, the rules were more important to them than the principles that the rules were based on. And I look at what religion is for a lot of people, and it can be a lot of things, but one of the things is a place where they can feel a sense of safety and security, knowing that if they obey the rules, they're going to make it to heaven. And I think that over time, specifically the church that I grew up in, has become more and more obsessed with the rules and less focused on the principles, because the rules are what keep you safe. The rules are the things that create that, like, the structure in your life, that if I conform to these and make these decisions, and if a church leader said it was okay, that means it's okay. I have the stamp of approval, and you have that kind of that validation, that affirmation that as long as it's within the rule book, I'm okay. It gives you a sense of peace.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
But I think if we really, like, the other part of religion is there's the principles that we're taught. And if we really do want to follow the example of Jesus, which is the example I was taught growing up, sometimes it means taking a deep breath and stepping back from all the rules and looking at the why. Can I examine myself? Can I examine the principles? Can I take a step back and see what are all these rules and what is all the structure built on? And do I need the rules in order to be a virtuous person? Do I need the rules in order to be loved by God? Do I need the rules? And in many cases, you might say yes. And in many cases, you might say maybe the letter of the law isn't as important as the spirit of the law. And I think what we're talking about in these conversations is taking a deep breath, looking at the letter of the law, trying to interpret what is the spirit of this law, what's the underlying principle, and can I live my life and allow myself to explore within the principle and not just be strictly adherent and focused on the letter. I don't know if that.
I loved that, Nate. That was beautiful.
I feel like that's the balance we're trying to find right now. Is I don't want to give up my faith. I don't want to give up my religion. I don't want to give up, like, the beauty and the good things that came here, but also the morality and having a moral authority and somebody make all my decisions for me. That's not working for me. And so how do I find this balance between beautiful, true principles and allowing myself a little bit of freedom to figure out how do these principles fit into my relationship with myself and my partner and my children and my life? That's the scary thing.
Mm-hmm. So, like anytime you're in a scary room, move slowly, but with purpose.
Hmm.
Man, Doug.
Yeah, right. Underscore that one again, Nate. Type it up and put it on our screen. Anytime you're scared in a room.
Anytime you're in a scary room, move slowly, but with purpose.
Jake mentioned, Nate, I totally agree with what you just said. When I consider, to speak to Jesus specifically, when I consider his interaction with people and his example, it is very much about the spirit of the law. And that's, in my opinion, that's not at all discounting how valuable and helpful following a letter of a law can be. And I love the quote, Doug. To go back to what Jake said, Jake, for me, when I started exploring personally my own ethic around sex and sexuality, it was also accompanied by exploring my own ethic around other things in the church. And I think it's really important that we do explore, for me anyways, I'm speaking for me personally, it was very important that I was able to explore my own personal ethic around many of the aspects of the church, sex being one of them. And only then and after that did I really feel like I gained my own, I'm going to use a church word, my own personal testimony. I gained my own personal conviction around what was right and what was wrong and how to live my life. And it's scary to step away from the guidelines of the church to explore that. And I would also, again, this is just me talking I think it has to be done for us to really get to know ourselves and get to know life, the reason that we're here. All of those things have to be done personally and on your own, and in a scary, awkward space oftentimes.
It reminds me of that saying, like, yes doesn't mean anything if no is an equal option. Yeah. And I think about it kind of like right isn't like necessarily right if you haven't taken it out and thought about it, that it could be wrong. You know, and as hard as that is to say, that's sort of the gist of it. Of you can't take right being right at face value. Doesn't mean you need to go out and go crazy and do whatever, but I think you really need to sit down and come to terms with some of these things and start to look beyond the lens which you're given, which is hard. But I also think in terms of those that have been, brought up in this, sort of the faith and in the circumstances we have, it's, if you truly want to have your testimony be unshakable, then you probably gotta test it and you gotta try it. Mm-hmm. And there can be great value in doing so.
I love that. This brings us back to Kristen's quote by Carl Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And I think many of us, I included, have beliefs that I have never questioned before.
Yeah.
And I unconsciously believe that my way of thinking, that my perspective is the right perspective. And I think the danger of a religious community is when you stop having faith and you start having certainty. And certainty is essentially faith with the removal of doubt. And if you have certainty that a certain act is dirty or immoral, or certainty that if your partner looks at sexual imagery, that they will degrade and devolve into the worst possible version of themselves. If you have certainty that like pleasure is bad, or that there's a lot of beliefs that we have, especially around sex, that we've never questioned. And if you have that certainty, it leaves no room for growth. And so I think the most difficult thing for couples having this conversation around, my Siri just kicked on. I think the most difficult part of having this conversation about pornography and sex is being willing to sit down. And if you want to make it forward, you have to let go of some of the beliefs that you've held on to your entire life that you have been certain up to that point were true. One of the ones that I see most commonly is that if my husband looks at pornography, it means he's a bad person, and he's capable of terrible things if he's capable of looking at this. And I see a lot of marriages end because of sexual imagery being a part of them, where the husband is an attentive father, he loves his wife, he cares about his children, he wants to be supportive, and just a good human. But because he's looking at pornography, that makes him a deviant and a terrible person. And we have that belief, like, oh, that's true. Because he hid this from me, he's probably hiding a whole lot of other things, and it's easier just to cut ties and lose all of the good than it is to get curious about my own beliefs around this one thing and see if maybe it's not as true as I thought it was. Was that?
And I want to maybe have a teaser here for our next show or next time we have a conversation, because one of the solutions I find to the dilemma we've all been speaking about so eloquently, we have a solution in our country for this dilemma that's wildly popular. And the solution is, you call this dilemma a sex addiction or a porn addiction. And then that becomes the way forward.
Yeah.
And so these difficult, painful, moral, existential, religious conflicts around sex and what our religion that we hold so dear and love, holds out for us. The calling these dilemmas an addiction is a powerfully meaningful solution for many people. And as we talked about, boy, is it useful for many people who are in these conundrums?
I think someone who is used to having sexuality prescribed to them, having sexual addiction treatment prescribed to them, is incredibly congruous, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It would make sense that if you are used to having things prescribed to you, that when this treatment is then prescribed to you with set methods on how to get better, here's the steps you follow. We can even count them and call them 12 or do whatever you want. Or there's these different programs that have prescriptive solutions to this problem. I think that's something in and of itself to realize of you're just kind of feeding back into that loop.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well said, Jake.
Nate, I am having to go. How much
Hey,
longer?
we all have to go.
Okay, great.
We're wrapping it up. So thank you everybody for joining us for yet another conversation about rethinking porn addiction. I feel like we did a lot of rethinking today.
Yes.
We would love it if you would share this, if you enjoyed it, with your friends or family members or anybody who you think would need it. These are on YouTube as well as on Facebook. Just go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com, and we love hearing from you, and we'll catch you guys next week.